welcome to Chuck Devore, Lieutenant Colonel of the United States Army, retired now with the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Chuck, just very quickly wrapping up the Ukraine saga, because I do want to turn to the other and arguably much worse threat we're facing from communist China. But before we do, give us a quick take on what is it that is likely to flow from the decisions now taken by the Finns to ask to become formally members of NATO, and a similar decision that seems in the offing in Sweden.
Right. So I think the important thing with the addition of Finland and Sweden to kind of the northern tier of NATO countries is, of course, in Sweden's case, they were always implicitly aligned with the West during the Cold War, even if formally neutral. And what we've seen over the last several years is continued breaches of Swedish space, of specifically their coastal regions by Russian submarines and probably unmanned submersibles. And so Russia has continued to violate Swedish sovereignty over the years, presumably because they could. And now, of course, the
There's
Finns
a famous
have
moment
very
when one of
interesting.
their submarines ground itself
Right,
in a prominent
right.
place in Sweden, as I recall, and was the source
Yes,
of
yes.
much
And,
merriment.
right. And of course, in the case of Finland, there's a long history since Finland was part of the old Russian Empire up until the Russian Revolution. And they had their own internal fight between the Reds and the Whites. And eventually the non communist Finns won the battle for independence. But ever since World War II, they've really had an interesting relationship where they subverted their own connections, or pardon me, their own independence from a foreign policy standpoint. And so what we're seeing now, I think, is a return to full Finnish independence and a realization by Finland that it would be beneficial for them to be part of this larger defensive alliance.
And do you expect Putin will take this as well as the other affronts to his pride and his power, as he seems to be trying to adjust to
Well,
certain realities in Ukraine?
yeah, I don't see where he has a chance or a choice because what you're likely going to see is bilateral security guarantees between the U.S. and the United Kingdom and Finland and Sweden, extended prior to formal NATO membership. So they're going to come under our bilateral security guarantees very soon. And what's going to happen essentially is Putin's going to pay partial payment for his reckless invasion of Ukraine with a virtual doubling of the front that Russia has to contend with NATO powers.
Yeah.
So if you look at the current um, front, if you will, between Putin and the NATO alliance, mostly the Baltic nations, of course, and the Kaliningrad Oblast. What you find with the addition of Finland is it essentially doubles the mileage that the Russians have to contend with.
Chuck, there's so much more to talk about on that. I did want to hit two other topics with you quickly in about 6 minutes that we have left with you. Let me ask you first. There are those who argue um, this really isn't our business, this Ukraine conflict and the efforts to reverse what has been done there. Our real preoccupation has to be China. I know you're very seized, as am I, with the threat from China. Do you agree with that, or do you see this as really something that has to be done in addition to
Yeah.
direct containment of China, if not reversal of the threats that we're facing there?
I do agree that the threat from China is, by its very nature, more of an existential threat to the United States, given their economy, given the size of their military, given the technological capabilities and the trade. They are a rising power. Russia is a declining power. That said, there are no national security interests of the United States that would be served by a Russian victory in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And furthermore, I believe that Russian victory in Ukraine would encourage China and show them that despite the Western alliance standing up and trying to help Ukraine, and despite the economic sanctions, that the old decrepit power of Russia won anyway. which would send exactly the sort of message to the People's Republic of China that perhaps an invasion of Taiwan would in fact be successful. So I see this current conflict and a potential conflict as very much connected, especially given the very close relationship that we now see between Russia and China.
Indeed. And that, I guess, to take away from that insight, your recommendation would be we must deal with both of these contingencies. And to the extent that we are watching a considerable depletion of our own stocks of equipment, some of it, in fact, actually being sent on of equipment purchased by Taiwan, no less, from us to help the Ukrainians. This is an appropriate use of such limited resources. Obviously, we need to restock our own
Right.
capabilities, but how do you see that, in the most practical terms at the moment?
Well, I mean, at the very core, the current conflict and a potential conflict are, at least would be extremely different insofar as the sort of forces that would be used. So, despite the agreements that we made with Ukraine for them giving up their nuclear weapons, our security arrangements with Ukraine aren't even close to the sort of security arrangements and guarantees we have with the democracy on the island of Taiwan.
Mhm.
And so, as a result, were China to invade, very, very likely you'd see the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy engaged almost immediately, along with our Japanese allies. And the sort of equipment and consumables that would be used in that sort of an engagement are completely different than what's being sent over to
Yeah.
Ukraine. What you're talking about, of course, are the infantry-based weapons. For example, your shoulder-fired surface-to-air weapons and
Mhm.
your anti-tank weapons. And yes, those things need to be produced. Frank, when we served together in the Pentagon, I remember being part of a mobilization exercise where we had a long lead expectation of a then Soviet invasion into the Middle East. And we had to convince Congress to surge the production of long lead items of consumables that would be used in high volumes in conflict, things like Sidewinder missiles and
Mhm.
TOW anti tank missiles. And these are things that are used in vast quantities and they're complex and they take a while to make, and especially with today's broken supply
Yes.
chains. So, absolutely, we need to be focused on that. We need to bolster our defense industrial base, and we need to make sure that we can produce the sort of armaments that are required in modern combat
Yeah.
and produce them here in America.
War footing is my shorthand call for it, and it seems to me long overdue. And I appreciate your clarity on the need to do that, no, not only for our friends and allies in both of these theaters, but of course for our own security as well. Chuck, we have about a minute left. Very quickly, as a student of what the Chinese are up to and their expenditures of immense amounts of money that seem, in no small measure, to be coming from American investors. What do you
Right.
think of this idea of having American government employees, federal employees, military and civilian, having their retirement funds sent by the likes of Larry Fink of BlackRock and the Thrift Savings
Yeah.
Plan to China?
It's a terrible idea, and it's a terrible idea for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, the political risk that there really is no such thing as contract in China. It's all at the whim of the Chinese Communist Party. So those investments could be worth zero within 24 hours.
Easily.
That's number one. Number two, the spectacular hypocrisy of these individuals that are pushing so called ESG investing for
Mhm.
environmental, social, and governance, none of which exist in China.
Right.
None.
Not a one.
It's not a transparent market. It's a very dirty country from the standpoint of pollution and
Mhm.
corruption, and it's financing a nation that wants to that sees us as an enemy.
Right.
So stop it. It's a silly idea.
Especially the likelihood that some of that money is going to go into the building of the weapons that China would use to kill your comrades in arms, Chuck Devore. Thanks for your clarity on all these issues, my friend, and joining us from time to time. I hope you'll come back to us again very soon. We'll talk morale with Elaine Donnelly, our own morale of military personnel, right after this.